All right, let's turn back to the White House and President Trump's decision to raise tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from 25 to 50%.
Industry Minister Melanie Joly says Canada is fighting back against the current unjustified and unlawful tariffs.
Well, it's hard. Certainly, we're talking to a lot of our counterparts in the U.S. Many of them do not agree with this. Everybody in the U.S. knows that tariffs are a tax.
Trump just detonated a 50% tariff on Canadian steel. And this time, Ottawa didn't flinch. The North American alliance that built the continent's supply chain is crumbling. What happens when your closest trade partner becomes your biggest disruption? On June 4, 2025, the Trump administration invoked Section 232 on national security grounds, doubling import duties on steel and aluminum from Canada and Mexico. But the real shock wasn't just the policy, it was who it targeted. Not China, not Russia, but America's own neighbors under USMCA. Canada, by far the top steel supplier to the U.S., accounted for 23% of all U.S. steel imports in 2024, nearly 6 million metric tons. That's more than twice as much as Brazil, and more than all of Mexico. These aren't just numbers. This metal runs through the veins of American cars, defense equipment, and infrastructure. Pulling this supply is like yanking steel from a moving engine. Washington just ignited a trade war in its own backyard. And Canada isn't backing down, it's building something much bigger. YouTube's algorithm won't always show you this. Subscribe so you don't miss what matters. Canada didn't rage, it recalibrated. Just 2 weeks after Trump's tariff bomb, Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped to the podium, not with threats, but with a plan. On June 19, 2025, he unveiled a new class of economic countermeasures, adaptive tariffs. These weren't static numbers on a spreadsheet. They shifted automatically, adjusting up or down depending on whether the U.S. negotiated in good faith by the July 21st deadline. Canada, in effect, turned trade retaliation into a living system responsive, deliberate, and impossible to game. But the real strike came underneath the surface. Carney's strategy reached into the mechanics of the economy itself. Government and defense contracts were quietly rewritten to prioritize Canadian-made steel and aluminum. Automakers were told, if you want to build in Canada, your inputs must be traceable. Every bolt, every beam, every ingot. No more rerouting through third countries to dodge tariffs. No more ambiguity. And then came the name that changed the tone, Steel Firewall. A phrase that wasn't just technical but ideological. A declaration that Canada's industrial core would now be guarded like national infrastructure. This wasn't a tantrum, it was control. Canada wasn't retaliating to hurt, it was retaliating to reshape. If you made it this far, chances are you're into this too. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And as Canada's Steel Firewall took shape, the divergence between the two nations' strategies became undeniable, not just in tactics, but in philosophy. In Washington, the approach was blunt and escalating. Trump made it clear, if Canada didn't concede, the pain would deepen. Talks of exemptions or carve-outs were shelved. The threat of expanding tariffs loomed large over industries already reeling. It wasn't negotiation, it was leverage by force, a show of economic dominance designed to extract quick political wins. But Ottawa refused to play by those rules. Carney didn't just reject the threat, he sidestepped it entirely. Instead of chasing exemptions, he quietly pivoted to something far more strategic: alliance building. Within days, his government opened high-level industrial talks with the European Union and Japan, nations eager to stabilize their own supply chains in the face of growing U.S. unpredictability. Canada wasn't isolating, it was integrating, just not with Washington. More critically, this wasn't about scoring points in a trade spat. Carney's team saw the tariffs as a rare window, an opportunity to force a nationwide industrial reset. Behind the retaliation was a deeper objective: to rewire Canada's steel and aluminum sectors for long-term autonomy, rooted in domestic production, diversified markets, and global standards. Ottawa wasn't fighting to protect the old system. It was laying the foundation for a new one. In this race, Washington used tariffs like a hammer. Ottawa used the crisis like a lever, and the balance of power across North America quietly began to shift. But strategy alone wasn't enough, not in a war that threatened jobs, factories, and national resilience. While Trump weaponized tariffs, Canada responded with capital, real money, real infrastructure, and a clear message: this isn't just retaliation, it's reconstruction. The question now was stark. What happens when a middle power stops playing defense and starts financing its own industrial revival? In late June, Ottawa answered. The federal government rolled out a $10 billion KD large enterprise tariff loan facility, offering preferential financing to manufacturers hit hardest by U.S. tariffs. These weren't handouts, they were deployment funds directed at modernizing plants, retooling production, and locking industrial capacity inside the Canadian border. At the provincial level, Ontario launched the Ontario Together Fund, designed to fortify the small and medium-sized enterprises that hold up Canada's supply chains. These firms were given targeted backing to reshore production, reduce U.S. dependence, and build redundancies that insulate them from future shocks. Then came the heavy lift. The Build Canada Fund, a sweeping procurement rule mandating that all steel and aluminum used in public infrastructure must come from either domestic producers or trusted FTA partners. It wasn't just about price anymore, it was about origin, traceability, and control. This was a capital counterstrike, and it changed the rules of engagement. Canada wasn't just absorbing damage, it was building something new from the wreckage. If a country can weaponize money as well as policy, who really holds the upper hand? Trade wars rarely stay bilateral, and this one didn't just spill over, it erupted onto the global stage. As tensions between Washington and Ottawa intensified, the world's industrial powers were forced into a binary decision: side with a volatile America or invest in Canada's calculated restructuring. The signs emerged quickly and decisively. Brussels was the first to move. Within days, EU trade commissioners issued a formal proposal to create a Green Steel Alliance, a multilateral framework aimed at supporting low-carbon, traceable steel production, with Canada at its core. This wasn't symbolic. It came with technical assistance, regulatory alignment, and a roadmap for co-investment in next-generation mills and clean smelters. The message from Europe was unmistakable. Canada, not the US, was the more stable and forward-thinking partner. Then came Japan. The Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, usually cautious and slow to intervene, issued an emergency commitment to fast-track aluminum exports to Canada, stabilizing a critical bottleneck before it could cascade. This was not just a supply agreement. It was an alignment of priorities. In a moment of tension, Japan chose predictability, trust, and shared industrial interest over a U.S. still stuck in tariff brinkmanship. Germany's voice added yet more weight. From Berlin, senior economic advisors praised Canada's measured yet decisive counter-strategy, warning that if Europe didn't keep pace, it risked falling behind in the race to build a resilient post-globalization industrial order. What was once a reactive trade policy was now being treated by Germany as a benchmark for how middle powers should defend and transform their economies in an era of fractured alliances. And all the while, Washington dug deeper into isolation. America First had turned into America Alone. The irony couldn't be sharper. The very tariffs meant to restore American strength were instead accelerating a shift in global industrial leadership away from the U.S. and toward a quietly coordinated bloc forming around Canada. So when your allies begin choosing your rival as the partner of the future, who's really winning the war? Steel and aluminum used to be raw materials. Now, they're weapons, and the battlefield is the North American economy. In the weeks following the tariff shock, the ripple effects hit the U.S. heartland hard. Auto plants in Michigan, aerospace hubs in Texas, once humming with cross-border inputs, began pleading for exemptions, desperate to keep their lines running. But with Washington holding firm, the fallout was immediate. Thousands of contracts suspended, shipments stalled, and entire production schedules thrown into chaos. Major OEMs like GM and Ford were forced into crisis mode. Supply chains once optimized for just-in-time delivery were now exposed, brittle, and vulnerable. For the first time in decades, corporate planners openly discussed relocating operations to Canada or Mexico, not for cost savings, but for survival. Meanwhile, the logistics backbone began to buckle. With cross-border materials delayed and redirected, steel transport costs surged 12%, and delivery timelines slipped by weeks. What used to move fluidly across borders now stumbled under the weight of economic nationalism. This wasn't just a disruption, it was a systemic breakdown. Canada didn't just retaliate, it reimagined. What began as a defensive response to Trump's steel tariffs evolved into something far deeper, a blueprint for industrial sovereignty. The Steel Firewall is no longer just a policy reaction, it's a full doctrine. A model built on verified supply chains, enforced localization, targeted capital deployment, and material transparency. It's not just about trade, it's about control over the arteries of a modern economy. This isn't a trade dispute anymore. It's a contest over national direction, over who gets to define the rules of production, resilience, and autonomy in the post-globalization era. So the question now isn't who wins the tariff battle. It's about, can North America ever return to integrated supply chains, or are we entering a new era of industrial Cold War? The lines have been drawn, not just between countries, but between two visions of economic future, one built on leverage, the other on rebuilding. The Steel Firewall may be Canada's answer today, but tomorrow it could become the global template. What if this isn't just about steel? What if it's the first draft of a new global playbook? If this made you think, give it a like. And if you want more, like and subscribe.